Dr. Sarah Chen had always believed that planets had their own voices if you knew how to listen, but Kepler 442b seemed determined to prove her wrong with its stubborn silence. 3 months of seismic monitoring had produced nothing but the expected rumbles of tectonic activity and the occasional complaint from mining equipment that was probably older than she was. "Another exciting day in paradise," she muttered, adjusting her acoustic detection array for what felt like the 1,000th time. The equipment was designed to pick up subsurface anomalies that might indicate valuable mineral deposits or geological hazards, basically, anything that could make the Kepler mining consortium either very rich or very dead. The abandoned settlement of New Harmony stretched around her monitoring station like a monument to optimistic planning and harsh reality. 20 years ago, it had been intended as a model community where human miners and indigenous Vorthak could work together in profitable cooperation. Now it was mostly empty buildings and the kind of silence that suggested everyone had better places to be. Sarah's acoustic sensors chose that moment to register something interesting, a rhythmic pattern that didn't match any of the geological signatures in her database. She frowned at the display, tapping the screen in the universal gesture of technical professionals everywhere. "Come on, don't be weird on me now," she told the equipment. The pattern persisted, a faint but regular series of vibrations that seemed almost deliberate. She grabbed her portable detection unit and followed the signal readings across the settlement's main plaza, past buildings that looked like they'd been evacuated in a hurry rather than abandoned gradually. The signal grew stronger as she approached the settlement's edge, where the carefully planned streets gave way to the rust-colored badlands that characterized most of Kepler 442b's surface. The acoustic readings led her to what appeared to be a small landslide or cave-in, a mound of dirt and rocks that didn't quite match the surrounding terrain. Sarah knelt beside the disturbed earth, holding her detection unit close to the surface. The rhythmic pattern was definitely coming from underneath the pile. "What the hell?" she whispered, then immediately felt foolish for talking to herself. 3 months of solitary research duty had apparently started affecting her conversational standards. She adjusted the acoustic sensors to filter out background noise and focus on the subsurface signals. What she heard made her stomach drop faster than a malfunctioning gravity generator. It was tapping. Weak, irregular, but unmistakably purposeful tapping. Someone was buried under there. Someone was still alive. Sarah activated her emergency communicator with hands that were suddenly less steady than her professional training preferred. "This is Dr. Chen at Monitoring Station 7. I need immediate excavation equipment and medical support at coordinates." She rattled off her location while her mind raced through the implications. The response came back with the sort of bureaucratic enthusiasm that made her remember why she preferred working with rocks instead of people. "Dr. Chen, please clarify the nature of your emergency. Are you reporting equipment malfunction or personal injury?" "I'm reporting a live burial," Sarah snapped. "Someone is trapped under approximately 2 meters of loose earth and debris, and they're still conscious enough to signal for help." A pause that lasted long enough for Sarah to question her faith in corporate emergency response protocols. "Dr. Chen, there are no current personnel assigned to your sector. Please confirm your readings and stand by for supervisor consultation." Sarah looked at her acoustic display, which was still registering the faint but persistent tapping pattern. "I don't need supervisor consultation, I need excavation equipment. Now." "Unauthorized excavation activities require corporate approval and safety oversight," the voice replied with the sort of mechanical politeness that suggested the speaker was reading from a manual. "Please maintain your position and await further instructions." Sarah stared at her communicator with the expression she usually reserved for particularly obtuse graduate students. "Are you telling me to wait for paperwork while someone suffocates underground? I'm telling you to follow established protocols for non-standard situations involving potential liability issues." Sarah turned off the communicator and looked around the abandoned settlement, mentally inventorying the equipment she could commandeer for an unauthorized rescue operation. The mining operations had left plenty of tools behind when they'd relocated to more profitable sites. 20 minutes later, she was operating a small excavation unit that was probably worth more than her annual salary and definitely not approved for independent use by xenoarchaeology researchers. The machine bit into the loose earth with efficient enthusiasm, clearing debris layer by layer while Sarah monitored her acoustic sensors for signs of life below. The tapping had grown weaker over the past hour, which either meant her buried person was losing strength or had lost hope of rescue. Sarah increased the excavator's pace, balancing speed against the very real possibility of accidentally crushing whoever was trapped underneath. 2 meters down, the excavator's sensors detected a void space beneath the remaining debris. Sarah switched to manual digging, using hand tools to carefully clear the last layer of dirt and rocks. What she uncovered made her stop breathing for a moment that felt like hours. It was a child. A Vorthack child, judging by the elongated ears that curved gracefully from her head and the grayish-blue skin tone that marked her as one of Kepler 442b's indigenous people. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old in human terms, though Vorthack aging didn't directly correlate with human development. The child was conscious but barely responsive, her large dark eyes tracking Sarah's movements with the sort of wariness that suggested she'd learned not to trust adults with her safety. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and she was clutching a small metal object that had apparently been her source of tapping sounds. "Hey there," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside the makeshift grave that someone had intended to be permanent. "I'm Sarah. I heard you calling for help." The child's eyes widened slightly, and her grip on the metal object tightened. She whispered something in what sounded like Vorthack dialect, too quiet for Sarah's universal translator to process. "It's okay," Sarah continued, reaching slowly for her medical kit. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" Another whisper, barely audible even in the planet's thin atmosphere. Sarah leaned closer, her heart breaking at the obvious fear in the child's expression. "I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you try a little louder?" The child's voice was like damaged silk when she finally spoke clearly enough for the translator to process. "My name is Nix. My stepmother said I was too much trouble to keep." Sarah felt something cold and furious settle in her chest as she realized what she was looking at. Not an accidental burial or mining disaster, but deliberate abandonment of a child who'd been left to die because someone found her inconvenient. "Well, Nix," she said, her voice steady despite the anger building behind it, "your stepmother was wrong. You're not too much trouble, and you're definitely worth keeping safe." As she carefully lifted the child from her intended grave, Sarah realized that her quiet research assignment had just become significantly more complicated. But looking at Nix's thin face and the way she held on to Sarah like a lifeline, she found she didn't care about complications nearly as much as she cared about making sure this never happened again. Sarah's research station had been designed for solitary scientific work, not for housing traumatized children who flinched at sudden movements and whispered responses to questions in voices so soft they barely registered on acoustic equipment. But after 48 hours of careful medical attention and gentle conversation, Nix was beginning to show signs of recovery that went beyond physical healing. "The nutrient synthesis is working," Sarah reported to herself, a habit she'd developed during months of isolation that now felt less eccentric with another person in the station. Heart rate normalizing, hydration levels improving, and she actually smiled when I showed her the mineral samples collection. Nix was currently curled up in the station's secondary bunk, examining a piece of crystallized quartz with the sort of intense focus that Sarah recognized from her own childhood fascination with geology. The child's elongated ears twitched occasionally, responding to sounds that Sarah's human hearing couldn't detect. "Nix," Sarah said gently, settling into a chair where she could maintain a comfortable distance, "can you tell me what happened before you ended up buried? I know it's difficult, but I need to understand so I can keep you safe." Nix's grip on the crystal tightened, and her ears drooped in what Sarah had learned was a Vorthack expression of distress. When she spoke, her voice carried the flatness of someone reciting facts too painful for emotional expression. "My father died in a deep mine collapse 6 months ago. Stepmother Kessa said I was his responsibility, not hers. The community elders said she had to care for me because of traditional obligations, but she said I was cursed because I can hear the ground singing. Sarah felt her eyebrows rise. Hear the ground singing. Nix's ears perked up slightly, the first sign of animation Sarah had seen from her when discussing her abilities. The rocks and earth make sounds that tell you what's underneath. Where the good metals are hiding, where the water runs, where the ground is weak and might fall down. That's echolocation, Sarah realized. Natural geological echolocation. Nix, that's an incredibly rare ability, even among your people. Stepmother Kessa said it was unnatural. She said the other community members were afraid of me because I could know their secrets. Nix's voice grew smaller. She said the mining companies would want to use me like a tool, and the community would blame her for allowing it. Sarah felt pieces of a larger picture clicking together in ways that made her stomach clench with anger. So she decided to eliminate the problem by eliminating you. Nix nodded, her dark eyes reflecting a maturity that no child should have to develop. She told the community I had wandered off and gotten lost. She took me to the old settlement and made me dig a hole. She said it would be quick and I wouldn't suffer long. But you had your tapping device, Sarah noted, gesturing to the small metal object that Nix still kept within reach. Father gave it to me when I was little. He said if I was ever in danger and couldn't call for help, should tap out the pattern he taught me. Nix demonstrated on the station's table, producing a rhythmic sequence that Sarah now recognized from her acoustic readings. He said someone who knew how to listen would always hear me. Sarah blinked back tears she hadn't expected. Your father was right. I heard you. Before Nix could respond, Sarah's communicator chimed with the particular tone that indicated official corporate business requiring immediate attention. She glanced at the display and felt her brief moment of emotional connection evaporate into professional anxiety. Director Harrison, she answered, trying to project the sort of competent professionalism that might prevent awkward questions about unauthorized rescue operations. Dr. Chen, came the reply, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. I understand you've encountered an unusual situation requiring corporate oversight. I rescued a child who was buried alive, Sarah replied carefully. She's receiving medical treatment and appears to be recovering well. A Vorthack child with reported geological sensing abilities, Director Harrison continued, his tone suggesting he knew considerably more about the situation than Sarah was comfortable with. Such individuals require specialized evaluation to determine appropriate placement and utilization. Sarah felt her jaw clench at the word utilization. Director, she's a 10-year-old child who was nearly murdered by her stepmother. She needs safety and stability, not evaluation for corporate applications. Dar. Chen, I appreciate your humanitarian concerns, but the child represents a significant resource that requires proper management. Corporate policy dictates that all indigenous assets with potential commercial value be transferred to appropriate facilities for assessment. Indigenous assets? Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain professional calm. She's not an asset, she's a child. She's a Vorthack with natural mineral detection capabilities living on a planet where such abilities have obvious commercial applications, Director Harrison corrected with the patience of someone explaining basic economics to a slow student. The corporation has invested considerable resources in this operation, and we have obligations to our shareholders to maximize returns on those investments. Sarah looked at Nix, who had gone very still during the conversation, her ears flattened against her head in obvious distress. Even without understanding the specific words, the child clearly recognized the tone of adults discussing her fate without her input. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah asked. Transport to the corporate evaluation facility on Kepler Prime for comprehensive testing and appropriate placement, Director Harrison replied. Standard corporate procedure for indigenous individuals with commercially relevant abilities. And if I refuse to cooperate? Then you'll be relieved of your research position and returned to Earth, while corporate security retrieves the child through proper legal channels. His tone remained professionally pleasant while delivering what was clearly an ultimatum. Sarah felt Nix's eyes on her and realized that her next words would determine whether the child's rescue led to safety or simply a more sophisticated form of exploitation. "Director Harrison," she said slowly, "I need 48 hours to complete my medical evaluation and prepare appropriate documentation." 24 hours, Dr. Chen. "Corporate transport will arrive at your location tomorrow evening." The communication ended, leaving Sarah staring at equipment that suddenly felt like countdown timers rather than research tools. "Sarah?" Nix's whispered voice cut through her racing thoughts. "Are they going to take me away?" Sarah looked at the child who had survived burial alive through determination and her father's legacy of teaching her to call for help when she needed it most. "Not if I can help it," she replied, her mind already working through possibilities that probably violated every corporate regulation she'd ever signed. "Nix, how good are you at hearing what's underground?" "Very good," the child replied, a flicker of pride entering her voice. "I can tell you where all the good minerals are hiding in this area. And where the ground is unstable. And where the old mine shafts go that aren't on any maps." Sarah felt a plan beginning to form, a plan that would either save Nix from corporate exploitation or get them both in more trouble than her xenoarchaeology training had prepared her to handle. "Nix," she said, "how would you feel about helping me do some very important research that might change how corporations treat your people?" 24 hours turned out to be exactly enough time for Sarah to discover that Nix's abilities were far more remarkable than either of them had realized, and for Corporate Security Chief Martinez to arrive with the sort of grim efficiency that made Sarah wish she'd chosen a career in theoretical physics instead of applied xenoarchaeology. "Dr. Chen," Martinez announced as he entered her research station flanked by two security officers whose expressions suggested they enjoyed their work more than was probably healthy, "you're in violation of corporate policy regarding indigenous asset management and unauthorized research activities." "I'm conducting legitimate geological surveys with the assistance of a rescued child," Sarah replied, positioning herself between Martinez and Nix, who was huddled near the acoustic monitoring equipment with the sort of stillness that suggested she was ready to run or hide at the first opportunity. "You're exploiting an indigenous miner with valuable commercial abilities without proper corporate oversight," Martinez corrected. "The child needs to be transferred to appropriate facilities for evaluation and placement." Sarah glanced at Nix, whose enhanced hearing had been revealing disturbing information about the mining operation's true scope over the past day. What they'd discovered together was either going to revolutionize understanding of Kepler 442b's geological structure or get them both quietly disappeared by corporate damage control. "Chief Martinez," Sarah said carefully, "before you proceed with any transfers, you should be aware that our survey work has uncovered some significant safety concerns regarding current mining operations. Such as extensive subsurface instability in the primary excavation zones," Sarah replied, gesturing to the data displays that Nix had helped her compile. "The geological formations are far more complex than initial surveys indicated, and current mining activities are creating cascade failure risks that could result in catastrophic structural collapse." Martinez glanced at the technical displays with the sort of professional interest that suggested he was more than just a security chief. "Dr. Chen, are you claiming that corporate geological surveys conducted by teams of certified experts were somehow inadequate compared to your unauthorized research with an untrained child?" "I'm claiming," Sarah said, her voice taking on the lecturing tone she'd perfected during years of teaching skeptical students, "that Nix's natural echolocation abilities can detect subsurface features that standard equipment misses. She's identified underground water systems, unmapped mine shafts, and geological fault lines that don't appear on any corporate surveys." "Convenient discoveries," Martinez observed. "Particularly given your current situation." Before Sarah could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the research station, the deep, urgent tones that indicated imminent geological hazard in the mining zones. Through the station's communication system, panicked voices reported what sounded like a major structural failure in the primary excavation site. "Sector 7 collapse, multiple personnel trapped, requesting immediate emergency response," crackled through the speakers. Sarah looked at Nix, whose ears were standing straight up with alertness. "Can you sense what's happening at the mining site?" The child closed her eyes, her expression growing distant as she focused on sounds and vibrations that Sarah couldn't detect. "The ground is falling in patterns," she said quietly. "Like when you drop pebbles in water, but underground." The collapse started where the big machines were digging too deep near the underground river. "How many people are trapped?" Sarah asked. 17, Nix replied immediately. "They're in 3 groups. Most are in the main tunnel, but some fell down into the old mine shafts that aren't on the maps." Martinez was listening to updates through his communication equipment, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Rescue operations are being hampered by unstable conditions. Standard rescue equipment can't safely access the collapse zones." Sarah felt pieces of a desperate plan clicking together. "Chief Martinez, Nix can guide rescue operations. She can sense exactly where the trapped miners are located and identify safe routes for extraction. Dr. Chen, I'm not authorizing the use of a child in hazardous rescue operations." "You're not authorizing it," Sarah corrected. "You're acknowledging that she's the only way to save those 17 people." Martinez looked at Nix, who was still concentrating on the underground situation with the sort of focused intensity that made it clear her abilities were far beyond anything standard equipment could replicate. "The water is rising in the lower tunnels," Nix announced suddenly. "The people there don't have much time before they drown." Through the communication system, rescue coordinators were reporting exactly what Nix had just described: rising water levels in the lower excavation zones and limited time for extraction before the situation became fatal. "Chief Martinez," Sarah said urgently, "corporate policy exists to protect corporate assets. Right now, those trapped miners are more valuable than any procedures you're supposed to follow." Martinez made the kind of rapid calculation that experienced security officers learn to trust. "What do you need?" "Transportation to the mining site and authorization to direct rescue operations based on Nix's guidance," Sarah replied. "And after the rescue?" Sarah looked at Nix, who was listening to the conversation with the sort of careful attention that suggested she understood exactly what was being negotiated. "After the rescue, we discuss Nix's future based on her demonstrated value as a partner rather than a resource to be exploited." The transport to the mining site took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Nix spent the journey with her eyes closed and her ears tilted toward sounds that only she could hear, providing updates on the trapped miners' conditions and the ongoing structural deterioration. "The main group is stable but scared," she reported. "The middle group has 1 person hurt but not badly. The lower group is in the most danger because the water is coming up faster than they can climb." The mining site was chaos organized around desperation. Rescue crews had established perimeters around the collapse zone, but their equipment was designed for surface operations, not underground navigation through unstable geological formations. Dr. Chen called Director Harrison, whose presence at the emergency site confirmed Sarah's suspicion that this disaster was bigger than anyone was admitting. "I understand you believe the indigenous child can assist with location and extraction. Nix can pinpoint exact locations and identify safe routes," Sarah confirmed. "But she'll need to work directly with rescue coordinators." Harrison looked at Nix with the sort of assessment that suggested he was recalculating her value in real time. "Very well. Coordinate with Chief Rescue Officer Walsh for immediate implementation." What followed was 3 hours of the most precise rescue operation in the mining colony's history. Nix guided rescue teams through underground routes that standard equipment couldn't detect, directing them around unstable areas and toward trapped personnel with accuracy that bordered on supernatural. All 17 miners were extracted alive. As the last rescue transport lifted off from the disaster site, Director Harrison approached Sarah and Nix with an expression that suggested significant policy changes were being considered in real time. "Dr. Chen," he said, "it appears we need to discuss a new research partnership agreement. One that recognizes the value of indigenous cooperation rather than indigenous exploitation." Sarah looked at Nix, whose confidence had grown visibly throughout the rescue operation as adults listened to her guidance and treated her expertise with respect. "Director Harrison," Sarah replied, "I think that's exactly the kind of partnership Kepler 442b has been waiting for." 6 months after the Sector 7 rescue, Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the newly constructed Indigenous Partnership Research Center, watching Nix demonstrate her geological sensing abilities to a group of mining engineers who had finally learned the difference between exploitation and cooperation. The underground river system extends much further than your current maps indicate, Nix explained, her voice now carrying the confidence of someone whose expertise was valued rather than feared. Her elongated ears had grown more prominent as she'd recovered from malnutrition, and her natural gray-blue skin tone had brightened to the healthy coloration typical of well-cared-for Vorthac children. "Can you identify potential excavation routes that would avoid disrupting the water systems?" asked Chief Engineer Rodriguez, whose respectful tone would have been impossible to imagine before Nix had saved his mining crews from the catastrophic collapse. Nix closed her eyes, tilting her head to listen to sounds that no human equipment could detect. "There are 3 safe corridors for deep excavation. I can guide your teams to them, but you'll need to promise not to dig below the singing stones." "Singing stones?" Rodriguez asked. "The crystalline formations that resonate with subsurface vibrations," Sarah translated. "They're natural geological sensors that help Nix map underground structures. Disrupting them would be like destroying her ability to help you." "Understood," Rodriguez replied. "Full protection for all geological features identified as significant by partnership specialist Nix." Sarah smiled at the title that had emerged from months of bureaucratic negotiation. Nix wasn't a corporate asset or an indigenous resource, she was a partnership specialist whose expertise commanded the same respect and compensation as any other technical expert working for the mining consortium. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Director Harrison had required considerable persuasion that treating indigenous abilities as partnerships rather than resources would be more profitable in the long term. But the success of operations guided by Nix's geological sensing had provided compelling evidence that cooperation produced better results than exploitation. Dr. Chen, called Martinez, who had evolved from security chief to indigenous relations coordinator, "We have the monthly community liaison meeting in an hour. Are you and Nix ready to present the safety improvements data?" Sarah nodded, gathering the reports that documented dramatic reductions in mining accidents and environmental damage since the partnership program had been implemented. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one child had evolved into a comprehensive reform of human-Vorthac relations on Kepler 442b. "Nix," she called, ready for another exciting afternoon of explaining to adults why listening to expert advice prevents disasters. Nix grinned, an expression that had taken months to return to her face. "I like these meetings better than the old ones where people talked about me instead of talking to me." The community liaison meeting was held in New Harmony's restored community center, where representatives from both human and Vorthac communities gathered monthly to coordinate mining activities with indigenous concerns. The setting was symbolic. The abandoned settlement had been revitalized as a center for genuine cooperation rather than colonial exploitation. Safety incident reports show a 73% reduction in structural failures since partnership protocols were implemented, Sarah announced to the assembled group. Environmental impact has decreased by 61%, and resource extraction efficiency has increased by 42%. More importantly, added Elder Kithra, a respected Vorthac leader whose support had been crucial for community acceptance of the partnership program, our people are being treated as partners rather than obstacles to be managed or eliminated. Nix stood to address the assembly, her confidence a stark contrast to the traumatized child Sarah had found buried alive just months earlier. "The partnership program has taught me that my abilities are gifts to be shared, not curses to be hidden," she said, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the community center. "My father always told me that someone who knew how to listen would hear me when I called for help. Dr. Sarah heard me, but more than that, she taught others to listen too." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion as she watched Nix address the assembly with poise that would have impressed seasoned diplomats. "The ground has many secrets," Nix continued. "It can tell you where the good metals hide, where the water runs, and where danger waits underground. But it can also tell you where different people can work together safely, where human machines and Vorthac wisdom can create something better than either could build alone." The applause that followed was genuine rather than polite. the recognition of a community that had learned to value wisdom regardless of its source. After the meeting, Sarah and Nix walked through New Harmony's restored streets, past buildings that now house joint human vortex research projects and community facilities that served both species. Sarah, Nix said as they approached their shared residence, the adoption papers had been finalized 3 months earlier, making their partnership officially as well as practically permanent. Do you ever regret hearing my voice that day? Sarah stopped walking, looking at the child who had become her daughter in every way that mattered. Nix, rescuing you was the most important thing I've ever done. Not just because it saved your life, but because it taught me that listening to voices others ignore can change everything. Even when those voices are buried under piles of dirt. Especially then, Sarah replied. The most important voices are often the ones that others try to silence. Nix smiled, her ears perked up with contentment. Then I'm glad you knew how to listen. As they continued toward home, Sarah reflected on how a routine geological survey had become a lesson in the transformative power of actually hearing those who need help most. The acoustic equipment that had detected Nix's faint tapping now served a broader purpose, listening for voices that corporate policies and community prejudices had tried to bury. The Indigenous Partnership Research Center continued to expand, employing dozens of vortex specialists whose abilities were now recognized as valuable expertise rather than exploitable resources. Other mining operations throughout the sector had begun implementing similar partnership programs, discovering that cooperation produced better results than domination. But for Sarah, the most meaningful transformation was personal. Nix had grown from a traumatized child buried alive by her stepmother to a confident young woman whose geological expertise was sought by major corporations throughout the sector. More importantly, she had become the daughter Sarah had never expected to have, and the teacher who had shown her that listening to buried voices could literally move mountains. Sarah? Nix asked as they reached their front door. Yes. Tomorrow I want to show you something interesting I heard underground near the old mining shafts. It sounds like there might be more children who need help. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. More children in danger. More voices that adults have stopped listening to, Nix clarified. But now we know how to hear them. Sarah smiled, realizing that their partnership had created something larger than either had imagined, a commitment to ensuring that no voice would ever again be buried so deeply that it couldn't be heard by those who knew how to listen. Then let's go listen, she said, opening the door to a home built on the foundation of a child's voice calling for help and an adult who chose to answer.